Um, Hello and good afternoon, everyone. At least it's afternoon in Kiev, where I'm sitting. I'm happy to moderate tonight's CANactions school talk. I'm happy to have three guests with me that are actually sitting in different countries, different time zones right now. I think it's a very good coincidence that we can connect finally and discuss some very interesting matters. The three guests that I have with me tonight are Wojciech Mazan, Tilman and Dijana Milenov. All three of them, they are very with you. All three of them are the contributors for the second edition of CANactions magazine that you can that you'll be able to download from our website very soon, probably in a few weeks. In this issue that we are preparing, we are talking about a very broad notion of land, or ЗЕМЛЯ, how we call it in Ukrainian. But what we really mean is that we are looking at the land and people in it in the context of the post-socialist region, those countries that were once socialist or affected by various foreign policies of the Soviet Union, which were notoriously harsh, I would say, for rural areas. We know that in all countries of former Soviet Union and many countries of Central and Eastern Europe, we still have the artifacts of the Soviet age, specific worker settlements. We have still the collective farms, or what remained from them. And they have this very specific type of agriculture that socialism embraced and promoted. Tonight, we have this quite unique chance, I would say, to discuss the three particular post-socialist contexts. The first one will be Serbian, Eastern German, and Polish. We will talk predominantly about the transformation of those ruralities caused by privatization and private capital inflowing into something that was once state-owned and then became private all of a sudden. We will speak of the social, economic, cultural effects of that transformation. I'm happy to hand over to the three guests that we have tonight with us, and they will briefly retell the content and the focus of their articles, and then based on that, we will launch the discussion. We will be very excited if you also join our discussion by commenting on the Facebook post from which this live screening is taking place. So whatever you write there will be handed over to us, and then we'll also address these questions that you have in the end of our tonight's event. We'll probably take 1 hour for the whole event. If we go beyond that time frame, that is excellent news, because that would mean that the discussion is very interesting. So I'm happy to hand over to Tilman, who will tell us about his article and his very interesting and somehow personal story.
Yes, thank you, Yegor, for moderating, and thanks for the invitation of CANactions School for this talk. And Dijana and Wojciech, I really enjoyed reading your articles from another geographical perspective. And I'm going to quickly introduce my article called Red Junker, or Communist Grandfather. And first of all, you could say, or some people say, agriculture is the beginning of culture. I don't know whether this is true, but definitely it tells a lot about a society or an organized group of people, what kind of food they're consuming and where does this food come from and in which way it is produced. So I'm going to share my screen and do a quick 3-slide presentation. So I hope you can all see.
Yes, we can.
So This is my grandfather, Albert Böhm, born in 1937, died in 2012. And he was an unconventional or certainly ambivalent character. During his career, he lived on the northeastern German countryside in Mecklenburg-West Pomerania, and he was the chairman or boss of a agricultural cooperative, so a collective farming organization of socialist Germany, of the GDR. And after the collapse of the East German system, the collective land, cooperative land, got privatized, and my grandfather Albert cheaply purchased 47 hectares of land, which is now still owned by our family. And in the article, I'm talking alongside the biography of Albert, who over the fortunes and misdeeds of the Eastern German agriculture, which span from 1945 to 1919, as we all know, with the ending with a peaceful generation and a quick transformation into a capitalist neoliberal system. And yes, it's the rubric of a social portrait. And like I said, Albert was born in 1937 in today's Czechia, Czech Republic, and had to flee, like many Germans, from the Eastern territories, like millions of Germans, and had a status of a refugee. And these refugees were in the beginning very happy over the land reform in the Soviet occupation zone. The land of former Junkers large-scale landowners got expropriated, and of alleged Nazis, of war criminals, got appropriated, and every farmer, little land walker, received about 10 hectares of land, which he should, for his own need and for the needs of society, cultivate. And but in some way it quickly shifted. The GDR's authorities wanted to reproduce the USSR's model of kolkhoz and solkhoz, large collectivized farms. The idea behind it was to share machinery, share land, share workers, share knowledge of the farms. And this process was very harsh and very brutal. They collectivized the lands, and you can imagine the situations of eyewitnesses talking about it, that they had big tractors and trucks driving over the countryside, having megaphones on them, making a kind of psycho-terror, and Stasi members, so Secret Service members, going into households, breaking windows, blackmailing farmers to join the agricultural collective. It was very forcefully done, and in the course of this forceful collectivizations, 15,000 farmers left the country, mostly to West Germany, left their land alone, and 200 numbers say about 200 people committed suicide. And this kind of big migration was only stopped by the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. And coincidentally, today is the 59th annual day of the construction of the Berlin Wall. So these collectivizations were very forcefully done. But Albert, my grandfather, who joined this agriculture later on as a LPG chairman, as a cooperative chairman, saw in the beginning certain optimism in the small agricultural farms. He saw a new spirit coming up, very motivated workers who believed in the system, who believed that it was an equalizing system from which everyone would benefit. But sooner or later, in the 70s, 80s, he also began criticizing this, the new system. The LPGs were merging to gigantic sizes, up to 15,000 hectares. And many farmers and land workers lost the identifying connection to the land, the kind of identifying moment to it. Also, a specialty in the GDR was the separation of animal and plant production, which created a competition between these two branches. And he criticized also this giant biography, bureaucracy, and also corruption happening in the GDR. It was a very nepotic system, especially in the end. And at the collapse of the GDR, the cooperatives and collectives had only about 1 year time to convert into new components of the market society. And so did the cooperative of my grandfather. The Ravensberger Agrar GmbH was founded out of 2 cooperatives. And the legal scientist Walter Bayer states in his 2003 work on the restructuring of East German agriculture that all of these conversions were legally problematic, and many of the farmers were sold off, and these LPG bosses, like my grandfather, cheaply purchased land. We say in German für einen Apfel und ein Ei, for an apple and an egg, and were getting very rich upon these lands, while East Germany was facing economic crisis, harsh unemployment, and again, a history, a big migration wave into the West. Alone of the northeastern region, Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, 300,000 people left, and the unemployment in the agricultural sector grew up to 60%. So the LPG bosses were the benefiters of these conversions, and the land nowadays has 30 times of the purchased value, and due to a lack of identifying moments to the country's land, it is now sold to investors and large companies, mostly of West Germany and Netherlands. And of course, there's also optimistic spirits. There's new cooperatives being formed that sell the land to local farmers. But in general, you can say that the aristocratic conditions once criticized by the communist idealists, and this kind of large properties, large landowners, a certain feudal system was in a way restored over the course of the GDR, and then radically reinforced after 1990. So a question is what we can ask ourselves: what was a reality on the socialist countryside, and how did personal biographies, how personal life stories got affected by all these political processes taking place over the last 70, 80 years? And I think a connective point between all the people representing certain geographical regions of Europe being present today is that these big transformations all took place after the Second World War. And I'm happy to join the discussion later on what are similarities and what are differences between our histories.
Thank you, Tilman. What strikes me most in your article and in this brief presentation that you just presented to us is, first of all, your honesty with which you retell a very personal story of your grandfather and different stages of his life, and that is somehow connected with the different stages of life of those German LPGs or collective farms. The second thing that is of a real importance for me, and something that makes our discussion very valuable, is the similarity of context, extreme similarity, because we're talking about East Germany now, but we could have easily been talking about Soviet Ukraine, because it's very easy to imagine a story of kolkhoz chairman who basically after the gaining of independence by Ukraine, who was able to privatize some of the lands and properties of former kolkhoz, his collective farm, basically. So I will have some questions from my side on your article and this presentation, and also I expect some questions from our guests and from our audience. So you may take time to think about possible questions to Tilman. And I would like to hand over to Dijana Milenov, and we will be who will acquaint us with the Serbian context.
All right. So hi, everyone. I'm going to jump straight into the presentation of my paper. So I hope everyone can see the screen. Excuse me, let's do this. Okay, so I wrote about PKB, which is Agriculture Corporation of Belgrade, and its privatization process. So PKB was a crop and cattle corporation initiated in 1947, excuse me, at the time newly born socialist country, Yugoslavia. So the cooperative was situated just north of Belgrade, which you can see in this map right here. And its area was 300 square kilometers, which is approximately a half of Belgrade's area. So what was specific about corporations in Yugoslavia was the so-called self-management system. So at the time of Yugoslavia's initiation, the country was very much modeled after the Soviet Union. However, in 1948, Yugoslavia's leader Tito got into an open dispute with Stalin, which set Yugoslavia into a quest for defining its own place in the bipolar world. This produced kind of a spin on a socialist system, which was, as proclaimed by the government, based on self-management and decentralization. So firms were led by the self-organized board of workers and basically functioned as non-profit organizations. One of the most valuable products of this system in Yugoslavia was PKB. It used to be one of the largest agricultural firms in Europe and a company which fed most of Belgrade and further areas for decades. And its success was in providing food from the field to the table. So this meant that the business didn't only include food production, but also processing and tourist catering services. And also it's important to notice that better standing companies such as PKB were able to invest excess money into building housing for their workers. And also larger firms built hotels around Yugoslavia, which their employees could spend their holidays in. However, in the 90s, a war happened in Yugoslavia, breaking the country into smaller pieces. This caused Serbia to go through enormous challenges and a rapid ideological shift, during which PKB production cycle also saw interruptions. And after the year of 2000, PKB's most profitable parts, such as food processing and selling branches, were secluded and then sold off, leaving the company at the level of raw material production and a large debt. So PKB remains a very productive company, but no longer a very profitable one. With the logics that government should not be in charge of food production, PKB was put on tender for the first time in 2015 and then again in 2017. And PKB's property and its land were traded in 2018 for 50% of its estimated value to a company called Al Dahra, which is from the Emirati. So what's controversial about this decision? Well, first of all, the second tender seems suspiciously ideal for Al Dahra company. It was announced the day after Serbian Prime Minister at the time met with Al Dahri president, and the condition for the buyer was to have 400 million euros yearly, which is 8 times more than what was asked for in 2015. And this high norm excluded most of local investors to bid. In addition, in 2017, at the time when agricultural land in Europe and in Serbia are becoming more valuable, PKB's net worth what was estimated to 100 million euros less than just 2 years before, without any criteria for this being made public. And secondly, perhaps more importantly, in my opinion, is that there is a law in Serbia which states that public agricultural land is a national treasure and should not be privatized. However, a series of measures were taken since the year 2000 allowing this particular land to be sold. So even though publicly owned PKB papers were assigned to PKB's company, making it legally appear as a private property. It's a little bit confusing, but this paradox is what made it possible for PKB to be sold. And so today, PKB as a cooperative is presented to Serbian public as a communist fossil, something of the outdated past. While this and similar deals with Emirati businessmen, such as Belgrade Waterfront Project, for example, are used as state propaganda. They're presented as large investments, crucial for Serbian betterment, which many would disagree with. So in particular, workers' unions are not satisfied with either the privatization model of PKB nor the idea of selling this land. Then also organization intellectuals that oppose further commodification of food and land have been objecting, and finally members of the Association of Pensioners and Former Workers of PKB have been protesting in front of Presidency of Serbia, asking for their shares to be paid. So as a conclusion, the government was eager to sell PKB and free itself from the debt. They readily rushed into making a deal with Al-Dafra, with a desire to appear as a state which enjoys trust of foreign investors. In reality, in my opinion, Serbia sold invaluable national resource for exceedingly small profits and no long-term benefits for the public.
Thank you so much, Dijana. I believe that our audience can relate quite easily to the general notion of what kind of organization PKB used to be. It was far from unusual for such a large socialist enterprise, whether industrial or agricultural, to have its own retail chain or even its own resort or hospital for workers. And it is also well understood that in this new transitional market economy, a lot of those assets were considered unprofitable. So I think that in this way, we can relate to PKB's story. And continuing parallels with Ukraine, it is also interesting that you say about land as a national treasure. In Ukraine, we had a moratorium on sale of agricultural land that was lifted just this year by the parliament. So from 2021, probably we will see a lot of processes that are close to the case of PKB and Serbia. Again, I encourage our viewers to think of possible questions to Dijana. And meanwhile, I would like to hand over to Wojciech, who will introduce us to the Polish context.
Yeah, hi. Yes, basically I'm going today to present briefly the text that I co-wrote with Robert Witczak for the upcoming issue. The title is Hidden Remains, Architecture of Former Workers' Settlements of State Agricultural Farms in Contemporary Poland. So basically, maybe in difference to other presentations, the focus is actually on the settlements, on the housing part of the state farms, so maybe of the domestic architecture. But regardless, the aim of the text is to investigate the examples of these settlements in two periods. First is the historical period, where the rise and fall of the socialist model of the state farms is analyzed. And the second is the contemporary period, which brings focus on the, let's say, current spatial and social condition of these settlements that are still remaining within the rural context of contemporary Poland. In effect, the text tries to problematize and tries to claim that these settlements, the settlements that were connected to the state farms, should be recognized as independent morphogenetic type of rural settlement. This claim is made possible because of the provenance of this model, and basically also because of its spatial characteristics. So briefly to outline that the first part of the text, as I mentioned, discusses the history, the genealogy of the model. So basically, as Tilman mentioned, it wouldn't be possible for all those projects to appear without the socialist project of the state that appeared after the Second World War. And it's not different in Poland. Basically, the land reform and the process of nationalization is the trigger for the state farms to be constructed. And I mean, just to understand the scale of this process, just by 1950, there were already 5,600 state agricultural farms within the context. Most of them would be also facilitated by the workers' settlements. So basically this allowed the state to create a new group, which we call basically village proletarians. And those people had to be housed somewhere close by to the state farm. Therefore, the settlements for the workers were created. And within the text, we are trying to claim that there are two types of these settlements. One that are connected to the existing village, and the others that are independent of the settlement network existing within the rural context. And our focus is actually directed more towards those that are independent, because being independent from the existing settlement network, we actually can claim also their uniqueness in terms of the rural form and actually try to recognize them as an independent morphogenetic type. And just to reiterate on the morphogenetic type, basically the classification of the villages or rural forms in the Polish context is basically quite historical, or it ends with settlements that are appearing around mid of 19th century. Therefore, it basically, by the definition, omits the most common, or most current addition to this context, which is done by the socialist state. But just to say something more about the settlement itself. So basically, it introduced an unfamiliar form of a housing block in the rural context. Those blocks were mostly standardized. They were made out of the blueprints that were just adapted to the plot, and in some cases, they were even prefabricated. In any case, the settlements operated in quite clustered way. So basically, the production facilities would be disconnected from housing, and then the housing would be disconnected, or at least not that close to social infrastructure. So basically, these three elements would operate independently. And that would somehow sum up the first part. The second part, the contemporary part, again, as in two other texts, basically starts with the process of transformation. So post-1989, the economical social transformation within the socialist countries occurs, and therefore there's a problem of what to do with the socialist heritage, or what was remaining. Therefore, I mean, as in other cases, basically, in our case, the state farms are put, they are given a notice that in 2 years they should make themselves profitable. If not, they would be actually closed. So by the 1993, I think most of them are actually closed, and therefore the state agency is actually owns housing, and they are starting to selling up. And therefore people actually are quite incentivized by reduction of price to buy this dwellings within those settlements, and they are in effect trapped since there is no work anymore, but they own apartments. They're actually trapped within the rural context indefinitely. So that's where the question of the text somehow starts. So basically, we see two pathways for those communities that they would follow. One is let's say, focus on the cooperative movement. So basically, when people would buy the apartments, they would still try to group themselves in some kind of cooperative, therefore to maintain the housing and the remaining social infrastructure. And then the other one is, let's say, more unfortunate, which simply is described as the decay of spatial and social condition within these settlements. Basically, I think what the correlation that can be drawn here is with the size of the settlement. It tends to be that the bigger settlements would more easily shift to, let's say, free market condition, and then the smaller ones would most likely not work that properly within the context. Yeah, thank you.
You have to turn on your microphone, Yegor.
Thank you, Tilman. So thank you, Wojciech. I think that, again, in your presentation and in your article as well, we can find a lot of connecting phenomena that are relevant for this whole post-socialist space. One of them is, of course, this housing privatization that happened quite ubiquitously in the region, and that led to this quite problematic consequences. People were not displaced in some case, which is good news. On the other hand, they were left with this asset that was sometimes unmanageable for them, and they did not have any institutional support to actually maintain this housing. Also, I think that these various types of new settlements that were either connecting to the old ones or not connecting is also a relevant phenomenon. And here I recall the experience of CANactions School, which had a program focused on rural areas of Ukraine, which ended about 1 year ago. And in there, one of the observed phenomenon in the Ukrainian context was that the new settlements, those that have no history, that dates before the socialist times, the new settlements proved to be much less resilient to the challenges of transition, the socioeconomic transition, than the others. So this might be an interesting thought for further discussion. So I hope that the three presentations that we had just now managed to also introduce our viewers to the topic that we intend to discuss. We will start the Q&A part now, and it will consist of 3 parts. In the first one, I intend to take an advantage of my moderator role and ask the questions myself. In the second part, I hope that our guests will come up with questions to each other. And after that, I hope to receive some questions from the audience that I will also address to our guests. So please let me start with Tilman and the case of East Germany. Since I also have an advantage of having read your article, I was wondering about the meaning that you put in some of the expressions that you use. For instance, when you describe the transition of this German collective farms into the new market conditions, you wrote that the socialist dynamics of pride turned into dynamics of greed. So first, I was wondering what meaning you put into the dynamics of pride and dynamics of greed. And then secondly, since we know that currently this whole region, East Germany and Germany overall, is affected by the policies of the European Union, I was wondering whether those policies contribute to this further land grabbing that was observed previously. Do they contribute to that, or do they prevent that?
So which question should I answer first?
As you wish. So the first one was about dynamics of pride and dynamics of greed. The second one is basically about the EU policy for the rural areas.
So the quote in the article comes from Peter Sloterdijk, who is a German philosopher and wrote in 2006 a quite questionable book called Rage and Time. And he says, this post-socialist countries faced a transition process from dynamics of pride towards dynamics of greed. And coincidentally, yesterday I had this discussion with one of my colleagues in Tbilisi, Georgia, with Lado, and we were discussing about everyday life in the USSR in this case. And as the GDR, it was also a nepotic system of favoritism granted to friends and relatives in fields of business, housing, sports, or vacation. So you kind of you kind of favored your people you knew in the system in decisions over influence in decisions and power structures. And interestingly, in many of these East German systems, as it was intended by a Marxist ideology, maybe, money didn't have so much influence as it has now. There was no real advantage if you made a lot of money. You can't buy much of this money. There was no certainly expensive cars. There was no pompous properties or very pompous way of building homes. So what would you bribe? What would you corrupt for? What would you make advantages for? And the answer is really in influence. It's the possibilities of generating a promotion for your nephew in his office, or for hotel accommodation for your grandparents in Abkhazia on the Black Sea, or for agricultural companies receiving harvesters or tractors by organizing a holiday camp for the machine factory workers' families. And a common goal in these systems, in these nepotic systems, was to be able to give orders, to have influence, to be able to decide stuff, to gain respect and esteem from people. So this is what is meant by a dynamic of pride here. And Sloterdijk furtherly says a command economy shifted towards a possession economy. So suddenly, after this collapse of the real existing socialist systems, the primate in these systems was not political or social influence anymore. The medium of language is replaced by the medium of money. So money can make populations greedy, and with money, having money, you're facing seemingly infinite possibilities and independences. With money, you could buy yourself everything: power, influence, machines, and, like in the case of my grandfather, also land. So this is the meaning of dynamics of greed, how I interpret it. And it's interesting to compare the pre-war conditions in East Germany, or maybe also in Poland, to aristocratic Junker or aristocratic large landowner conditions, which had different dynamics too. And an historian, Michael Heinz, says the position of the cooperatives on the countryside contradicted the ideas of a communist society. Their rural hegemony, especially in the north of East Germany, is comparable to the situation of pre-war landlords. Both types of operation decisively determined the development of rural areas. They took care for housing, road construction, and their influence reached into the private sphere of their employees. However, an equation should be rejected. So cooperative bosses were rural hegemons, part of a society of pride. And in the early 90s, they converted their rural authority, gaining huge amounts of land by often faking accounting or faking the value of property, cattle, or machinery. So paying far too small compensations to farm and land workers, and monopolizing the one's collective capital in their hands. And this sounds to me also clearly like a practice of greed.
Thank you. Yeah, it is very clear. So I was wondering if you could also comment briefly on the current EU policies that affect those former collective farms.
So there's EU subsidies, especially for canola, so rape, and corn. And even if the soil is not made for this stuff, that large landowners actually often grow these crops because they get more money out of EU subsidies than they would get from the money for selling the stuff. So how it is connected to land grabbing, in a way, you could say that large investors would sell huge amounts of land in order to gain EU subsidies. And maybe the reason why you get a subsidy should be questioned in this context. And nowadays, facing these large parts of lands that are owned by LPG bosses, you could say, as before, that there is no strong identifying emotional connection to the land, and the land is sold to the highest bidders. So mostly large investors that have no whatsoever connection to the region or to the to agriculture in general, and this just see this land and countryside as an investment opportunity, as a stable investment opportunity, especially after the 2008 food and financial crisis. There was a shift in large investments in the land, as also Dijana is describing in her article. And yeah, you could say, like I said before, an optimistic spirit is in new democratically formed cooperatives that are connected to banks and to credit institutes, and that try to also buy the land when it is sold, when it is not sold on winding paths or overpriced, and try to give it to local farmers. And this is a practice that happens nowadays in East Germany and will hopefully enlarge its contexts.
Thank you. This is a very interesting insight on the current state of affairs. And as you just said, it's interesting also to talk about the same phenomena in the Serbian context. So I also have a few questions to Dijana. But in fact, I would like to start with the question about the socialist period of PKB, this kind of golden era, while everything was still fine. So you mentioned in your article specifically that PKB was managed by the self-organized board of workers who made the decisions, and that also that at that time the Yugoslavian authorities declared that self-management and decentralization are the goals of that specific system and society. And this has allowed to turn PKB into this versatile scientific and production conglomerate that it used to be. However, probably as a Ukrainian, I have this inherited distrust in sometimes in the socialist rhetoric. So based on your research and your competence, I would like to ask to what extent did this old PKB live up to this high announced goals of decentralization and self-management? Did it really work this way then?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for this question. I think it's a very important one because I think we should need to be careful about romanticizing certain periods, or any periods rather. But I can start. Perhaps we're talking about the right to housing, which I briefly mentioned. So that was one of the goals that the Yugoslavia set, and it was supposed to be done through these board of workers. And it's important to say that definitely there was nepotism, corruption and injustices done in this process. That is for sure. What I think it's important though, or rather sad in a way, that today we don't have anymore this idea of right to housing. However, we did keep these other, corruption, injustice, and other injustices. So that's why I think it's important to talk about this history. So I would say that overall, the self-management system did give a lot of agency to professionals and workers, and that many of them resolved their housing situation with this program. And many of the housing that was developed at the time still holds high value, which, I think it's important also to note. And in some cases, or in many cases, it was a place where, CEOs, engineers, factory workers, they all lived in same living conditions within same buildings. So in that sense, I think it was a successful program.
So it was quite egalitarian then.
Yeah.
This is an interesting insight, and I actually would like to ask another question that is rather hypothetical, but very interesting to me. I hope it will be also quite curious for you. So we know from your article and from what you told us today about the story of privatization of land that belonged to PKB. You also mentioned that a lot of activities and facilities that belong to PKB portfolio now no longer exist. They were dissolved because they were deemed unprofitable or unnecessary. However, it is interesting actually to fantasize about the PKB without this privatization. So how do you think if PKB actually ownership and operation model was the same as it used to be back then, how would it look like in the present economy, provided that this privatization never took place? How would it function in this type of economy that we have now that some researchers call post-Fordist?
Yes, so you're right that I mentioned, so basically the more profitable parts of PKB were sold. So no, it's not that they were not necessary, they were actually profitable. That's why they were separated or first sold.
Thank you for correcting me.
No problem. And actually, yeah, it's an interesting question, also a hard one, and I don't think I can have a full answer on how it would function today. I think it would definitely have to go through some changes. Actually, one of the proposals for PKB done by one of Serbian economists, Branko Dragaš, was that maybe there is an opportunity for mixed use, or mixed ownership rather. So that majority, or like 51%, would be owned by the government, around 15% would be owned by the citizens of Serbia, small percentage would be owned by the workers of PKB, and then let's say around 30% would be sold. And in that way, sold ideally to Serbian citizens with kind of a limit that one person could buy. So in that way, PKB could pay off their, their debt and invest in further production. So that is kind of one possible idea. And as mentioned before, corporations today in the world and in Serbia, especially agricultural corporations, seem to be doing well. So I think that is something to be explored.
Thank you. I think it's very important to have these models, even if they are theoretical models, for possible functioning of such entities, because there is clearly also a lack of ideas in this field, apart from privatizing those assets, at least, again, returning to Ukrainian context, it's still privatization heyday in Ukraine, and this is probably the only government policy available for such cases. And learning from this experience, or at least from the ideas that we can borrow from another context, is extremely valuable.
If I could add, excuse me for interrupting.
Excuse me, sure.
I was actually reading a little bit about, I think it's interesting what you said, but I think there is also different way or different models of privatization. And for example, in Hungary, I think the privatization is done maybe a little bit more successfully because it's more transparent. The set of rules are a little bit more clear. And I don't think that's the same case, at least in Serbia, where things are kind of done behind the closed doors and with no strategy, like overall strategy for agriculture development, or how these investments would actually better our economy.
Thank you for this comment. I think that we should all have a closer look at Hungary now and their model, probably to learn from them. I'd like to continue the discussion, handing over to the third guest who presented today, Wojciech, and to the story of Polish collective farms and settlements around them. Since your presentation, also the article, deal with the somehow with the planning features of this collective farm model, PGR model. You actually, I think you did a great job describing in the article the main aesthetic, infrastructural, and planning features of this model. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment on that, on what exactly constituted those forms of the PGR model, and also which of those features persist in the current conditions in the rural Poland.
Yeah, I think there's one distinction to be made at the very beginning. Those were not cooperative models as the ones described by Tilman. And I think this is something that is often mixed. We had cooperative farms as ones described by Tilman, but those were actually state-owned, and workers were, as I said, basically village proletarians, where they were hired to work with them. They would not own, let's say, part of the farm. So I think that's quite an important distinction. But moving to the architectural aspect, which I think for me is the most interesting, I think firstly, one has to say that the vast standardization of the architecture that was used to facilitate the state farms model, I think that's somehow quite interesting and maybe unprecedented for the rural context. Of course, there were attempts before at the beginning of the 20th century to use the standardized models or typologies to somehow colonize the countryside. But I think on this scale, as the state farms attempted to modernize the countryside with elements that were somehow pre-designed and just later on adapted to specific contexts, is something never done before or to some extent after. So I think this is somehow, I mean, the scale, just the sheer scale of the project is something that I think is already making it quite interesting. But then, of course, what I was trying to show on the images, let's say the architecture that we would associate with the city or with the urban context. So let's say the housing block is introduced to the countryside, and what this somehow introduces is this connection to the ground. So basically, for the first time, family is not owning the plot next to the house. They are not able to basically roam freely outside of their house. And of course, this architecture also enforces the nuclear model of the family for the first time in the countryside. So I mean, of course, I mean, one can criticize this for those aspects, but I mean, on the other hand, one also has to recognize that this was done during the post-war context under, I mean, the vast, let's say, destroyment of the country. And I mean, for the first time, there was basically a clear concept to provide housing for the rural areas. So I mean, it's not easy to somehow say that this model is bad or wrong. I mean, bad or good. So yeah, and I mean, what remains? I think what doesn't remain is social infrastructure. So all the canteens, nurseries, small GP stations, etc., etc. All this is gone. Most of the agricultural facilities are also not. I mean, they are existing in some cases. In some cases, they are basically deteriorating. And what remains and is mostly seen is basically what I was trying to describe in the text. So basically, the housing. But the housing and the settlements are existing, but the social infrastructure doesn't. So basically what allowed them to exist in the first place, social infrastructure, connections to other settlements, public transport, etc., etc. This is not remaining in the context. The only thing that remains is the housing aspect. Therefore, I mean, of course, they are not possible to exist under normal conditions, right? Because they are just standing on one leg.
Thank you. I guess that distinction that you made in the beginning is extremely important. And the problem is not just with our definition, but also with the socialist definitions, because I think similarly to Poland, in Ukraine, those farms were actually state-owned and workers did not own anything. Nevertheless, they were still called колективні господарства, колгоспи, which literally means collective farm
Yeah.
So
in Poland they would be called as state farms, and we would have
state farms.
Let's say production cooperatives, which would be closer to what Tilman described as a model.
That's great. Also commenting on this type of housing that basically breaks attachment of households to lands because they don't have the ownership of the adjacent land plots. If we speculate a little bit more about that, you mentioned that this might be directed against the concept of nuclear family, but
it enforced it, right? I mean,
enforce it, yeah.
Yeah.
But could it also signify the intention to break this private or personal connection to land, leave only collective opportunities to be on the land, to work on the land?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is basically the story, right? Because maybe something what I didn't mention, since it's so specific to the Polish context and but one doesn't want to go there, is that basically this model that I'm describing, the state farms and therefore the settlements, are basically occurring in what we would call Western and Northern territories. So basically the lands that before the war would be incorporated within the German state. So basically there is no connection to the land. Therefore, they are actually possible to exist because you have to imagine that these territories were not part of the Polish state. Therefore, after the war, they are incorporated within the state and people are basically resettled. So as Tilman mentioned, there are forceful resettlements of German population to the Germany, and the same happens for the Polish population. So basically they are resettled from Ukraine or from other parts of pre-war Poland to these lands, and therefore there is no connection existing between the new residents or the new settlers of those structures and the land. So I think that's why it was possible to be enforced, because the program wasn't directed specifically towards these territories. It was directed to the entire country, but it happened with the highest amount of those structures within those territories. So I think this proves somehow the initial hinge that since there is no connection between the user and the land, is actually easier to, of course, nationalize and therefore to create those models.
Yeah, thank you. I guess that this is a very essential and sad aspect of the socialist rural policy, this displacement effect that is observed.
It's not inherent to socialists, right? Period. It's inherent to the post-war condition. It happens that it happened within the socialist state, right? I mean, it would happen in any state after the Yalta conference.
Mm-hmm.
This
is an interesting point. Tilman, did you want to comment on that as well? Did I understand your intention right?
In some way, yeah, I just thought you would also, I guess you would also have it in Yugoslavia, but after 1990, no, this big waves of ethnic cleaning, no, this big resettlements of whole parts of Serbian or Croatian population. And so it's maybe an issue all the countries are facing. What I was particularly interested in, or in the Polish case also, was this this resettlement, like let's say German population gets kicked out of a village, of a town, and new Polish population comes in from the let's say Russian Soviet or from the Soviet Union annexed territories. So where would this new populations be settled? Would there be the new standardized housing blocks being built, or would they also be settled in the old village structure? You're describing in your article this kind of interesting dichotomy between the old village structure centered around the church and this, let's say, new chessboard grid made standardized housing. And I found a quite interesting image of the town of Rostock, of East Germany also, where you can also see this clear distinction. As I'm sharing my screen, you could see it here maybe, no? That you have these two parts of town, no? This kind of in the 1960s to 70 built part, and here centered around a small church the old village structure. So my question would be, where would the new populations be settled? And could you describe once more the connection between the people living here in this part and the people living in this part, in the particular Polish case, because it's also quite much connected to religion, as you're describing it.
Yeah. No, I mean, basically people would be resettled, mostly the village from former Polish land would be resettled to Western and Northern territories. So interestingly enough, somehow the neighbors would, there would be possibility that the entire village would be actually resettled this way. And then the question, I mean, we know the cases in which German population was allowed to stay and they decided to stay. But in most of the cases, I guess, as you know better than I do, they were forcefully resettled to Germany, or they didn't decide to stay, or they were basically forced out. So the new settlers, they would occupy the structures that were there within the villages, so basically the old German houses. And then, I mean, later on, whenever the model appears, they would be encouraged to get flats within the new settlements, right? Or I mean, if the settlement appears next to the existing village there. And I mean, I think one has to understand the condition under which these people would live, right? I mean, they would live within the traditional family structure of the multi-generational scheme, which would be quite patriarchal, etc., etc. Therefore, when the opportunity arises to live within the apartment that has a bathroom and a kitchen, I think there's not much to think, right? I mean, it's simply a notion of progress. Therefore, I mean, that's why they were that popular, and the state was able to secure the population, the workforce for the state house. And I mean, and then let's say the condition between let's say, I mean, the distinction between the two parts. I mean, it goes hand in hand with the class distinction. Simply, people living within the village, within the old structure, they would own land. People living within the settlements, they wouldn't. So basically, there is clear distinction between the landowner and maybe not a peasant, but it's proletarian, right?
Land worker, maybe, no? You could call it.
Yeah, I mean, as you wish to somehow define it, but yes, I mean, there is a clear disconnection, and of course, I mean, one is then somehow the one brings progress, meaning the one that lives in the settlement, and the other is more traditional. Therefore, I mean, the distinction between the role of the church inside of the old settlements is so important to recognize, and therefore, I mean, let's say the influence of the social infrastructure within the new settlements is as well important to be recognized. Because I mean, just to say, I mean, that the socialist state was also able to build 1,400 schools around the entire country. So I mean, one has to recognize that this is actually the project of modernization on unprecedented scale. Therefore, I mean, it was, I guess, so easy to create these farms.
I mean, in all these contexts of also socialist or communist, real existing socialist communities and societies, you're facing this this formalism. No, you have this kind of Marxist ideology underlay, and the state is forced to continue the written word. You can't organically adapt to changes. There's the 5-year plan. There's this very formal and very stiff kind of corset which the development of also agriculture is put in. And I would say in the village context or in the agricultural context within the cooperatives who were also providing housing for the workers, you could say that there was this clear thought within the ideology of an urbanization and as of an industrialization of the countryside. So at any cost, you want to have the village populations on the same standard as the city population. So you start also building prefabricated housing. You very rarely renovate the old villages, deal with the old structures. You kind of have also this Kristalla theory, no, of the central plans, no, that there's a central village and smaller villages you simply let die out. And at least how it was in the GDR, there was a very late realization in the 70s and 80s that you actually depend on these small villages also, and that you depend on this individual housing, that you cannot just view the village structure as a city structure. And the same goes with the career and the view of the profession of a farmer, no? As you described, these people in the new settlements, in the prefabricated settlements, land workers, whatever you want to call them, they, within the Marxist ideology, they were seen as specialized workers. So they were not seen as some kind of farmer who had a wide knowledge, who had an identical connection to his countryside, who had a knowledge of the region of the climate, but it was a land worker who could be used as a cell within a system, as an operating cell on huge areas of land. So there is this this great contradiction between the rural realities and this kind of corset being put in as a Marxist ideology on these urban or countryside structures, I would say. So in my opinion, this is also one of the reasons of the failure of the socialist country ideal. And as it is put in Wojciech's and mine article, there's a lot of negativity about this cooperatives and collectives. And I would ask myself, what were the positive aspects, and what were actually the fortunes of these cooperatives? And I think maybe in a Serbian context, you can see much more positive aspects, because maybe the Yugoslavian system was much less stiff. I don't know if you would agree on this, Dijana.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I think maybe one of the differences between Yugoslavia and maybe some other socialist countries is that the Communist Party was chosen in Yugoslavia after the Second World War. And also in the case of PKB, so of this large agricultural farm, it was publicly owned, meaning it was owned by all the people of Yugoslavia, and workers were there by their will, right? Like they could choose to work there or not. And yeah, it's an interesting question why in this case there are so many negative connotations with these cooperatives in Serbia as it might be in other countries or post-socialist countries. But I actually wanted to ask Wojciech, a question about today's state of PGR settlements, the prefabricated ones, because you mentioned that the social programs kind of are the ones that disappeared, and I'm wondering why, and also because, for example, in the case of New Belgrade, which is a whole area in Belgrade, which is like a modernist project, during 90s, it was the time where actually all the social programs kind of boomed in the sense they were kind of half illegal, but kind of the opposite happened. I mean, it's not obviously, it's quite different because this is a urban setting of these settlements, but yeah, I'm wondering if you could comment more on the today's state.
Yeah, so basically the PGR model was dismantled after the, let's say, 1990. I mean, during the 1990s, the land was privatized, and since there was no state farm to basically facilitate and pay for the social infrastructure, it was also closed. So as simple as that, the state farm was the provider and the one that actually would keep those things running. And since this disappeared and people stayed within those settlements, but owning the apartments, they were left without the social infrastructure. I mean, even just to add one thing, the only, let's say, state farm that survived is one in Kiech in south of the country. It also wasn't able, just by the, let's say, it wasn't able to keep the social infrastructure. It still operates. It's not called PGR anymore. It's not called the state farm, but it's actually still state run. And they're actually prospering quite well. But they decided, I mean, to basically decide on things simply on the issue of profit. And since this is not profitable, and you have to pay for it, meaning the social infrastructure, you just cut it, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, this is quite short-sighted to think that way, of course, but yeah, that's how it was rendered during the, or it is still rendered during the late capitalist period, right? So as simple as that, basically the market decided.
Right, so people still live there, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's like, I think it's like best described, I mean, this naivete of the system that came after the socialist system is best described by what Wałęsa said. So basically the first president, he said this: we have left people there in state agricultural farms and other places. We have left them to their own. We thought that capitalism and market economy is going to fix it by itself. This is a mistake that we all have made, and I also did. So I mean, they were just naive that actually it will resolve by itself somehow. Of course, it didn't, right?
Right.
I would like to suggest to continue now using the questions that we received from the audience. There is a question addressed to Dijana, and that is focused on the post-Yugoslavian context. It comes from Bartek Potralski, and I will read it out loud now. Did I understand correctly? Was PKB some sort of system of agricultural farms owned by the state, or the only one mentioned next to Belgrade? Were there any other farms in Yugoslavia which worked that way, or beside this one, the rest of agricultural production was in private hands of farmers? How did state accommodate workers in PKB? Did they address some special housing program, or it was based on the labor from city of Belgrade?
Yes, thank you for that question. So maybe I can share quickly again that slide with the map. This one.
Sure.
So maybe it's going to be a little bit more clear. Doesn't want to change. Here it goes. So yeah, so this is Belgrade, kind of Belgrade's borders. And so all of this land in red belonged to this large company or corporation. Let me see what was the rest of the question. So basically, after the World War II, everyone that had more than I think 10 hectares of land would have to give that access to the state, which was then given in some cases to other families, so to work on, or would become publicly owned. And in this scale, there were no other large cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives in Yugoslavia, for what I know. But the self-management system, which I have discussed, was present at all different kinds of firms. So that is something that is, I guess, the same for other companies. I hope I answered the question.
I think I can.
Sure. Wojciech, please.
Can I maybe add to this question to follow up what Bartek asked? Because it was also interesting for me that actually your text talking about the land and the agricultural production was quite focused on the city. Right? I mean, it's still the capital, the Belgrade. And then I think somehow trying to reiterate what Bartek was asking, were the people working within the PKB, let's say, agglomerate or agricultural corporation, were there actually inhabitants of Belgrade, or would they live next to the infrastructure?
Yes, thank you for, yes, that was an important part of the question. So there were and there still are housing within this land that I showed you. So there were kind of these, I guess you could say, isolated moments within the large land. And I believe that some of them probably lived in Belgrade as well, or in different cities around. The actual state of these buildings right now, I'm not totally sure. I know they exist. I know people still live there. But yes, that is important to say. So basically, the company would build housing for them, and they would get the right to live there. And then in 90s, they could buy it off for a small amount of money.
Yeah, which I think also shows, let's say, the socialist condition that in order to basically, after the turmoil of the war, to feed the country, you have to centralize. Otherwise, you will fail. I mean, because, I mean, do you see any other possibility to feed Belgrade, not having for, let's say, 40 years the PKP structure? Because, I mean, it seems somehow that, I mean, this is created in order to facilitate the needs of the city. That's why it has this scale, right? And that's why it's also so close. That's why it's quite interesting for me, because within the context that I was analyzing, we don't see this clear connection. I mean, of course, there is a connection to the urban from the rural, where in your case, it's actually quite accelerated and I mean, super clear, because it is just the corporation for Belgrade city, which is, I mean, quite interesting also from the perspective if you would turn it and look from the urban to the rural rather from the rural to the urban. I mean, it's just quite a specific case, I think. Yeah,
that's a good note. Yeah, and I think that's why, I mean, that land is obviously very important as an agricultural land, but also its proximity to the city and future developments of the city, new roads and things like that. It is, that's why it's, in addition, but that's why it's problematic not to own that land or the country. Yeah, and
also, please.
I wanted just another question for Tilman, because I love the description that you gave of your grandpa, and also of this process of communist leaders kind of becoming very readily, in a way, capitalists, and it's a story that's also present in Yugoslavia. Could you give maybe your opinion on why was this so easily possible? Or a little bit to elaborate on that.
Possible as like the personal shift of ideology in the heads of the people, or made possible by the political system surrounding them?
I was more thinking from the personal perspective, because that was kind of your article, and I think that's kind of, for me, interesting.
I suppose you can say in some way there was in the GDR times a big disillusionment, no? So people were kind of not believing in the system anymore. No, they were seeing like my grandfather described, the last agricultural machinery they received in the mid-1980s, and for this getting this machinery, they had to make 3 years holiday camp for the children of the workers of the machine factory. So he said often in an interview he gave in 2003 that it kind of hurt him a lot to see this system collapse and fail so much. So also within this losing of identical moments, there was this kind of disconnection towards the system, and a slow, let's say, a slow shift towards individualization and seeing your own benefit, your own possibilities. And I guess this kind of encouraged many of the former cooperative bosses to act in this way. And in some way, you can say also that the article draws a negative picture of these LPG bosses, no, of these cooperative bosses. In some other aspects, you have to say that some of them cared for their workers, some of them cared for the land, some of them were working in order to keep the lands fertile, to keep the lands working. And of course, there were also the people that knew the regions, that knew the structures, that knew how to behave in the agriculture. So in my opinion, the decision that they became the new chairman of the agricultural companies managing the lands after 1990 was not the wrong decision, but this privatization of the state land and of the LPG land and the cheap selling towards these few people to these few bosses, this was the mistake being done. And if, like Wojciech said, also the state land that was owned by the state, also in Germany, also this was sold mostly to these ex-LPG chefs. So it was a time of anarchy in the 1990s, I think in all these post-socialist countries, you can say. And it was a time when there was a possibility for big independence on the countryside if you lived there, political independence, but of course extreme hardships also and very corrupt practices taking place in the transformation processes.
I just want to add that I actually think that your essay is very balanced in a way of showing the complexity of the situation and of the personalities. Yes, I don't think.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm checking, and yeah, I see that we do not have any more questions from the audience so far. And given the current timing of the discussion, I believe that we will need to wrap up. I personally view this talk as a very nice preview to what is coming in the magazine itself. So I thank to all the viewers who are still with us, and I encourage and even urge you to look for announcements on CANactions website and CANactions social networks, announcements of the release of the new issue that contains the articles of the guests that we have tonight. I would also like to announce another similar event that will happen in 1 week. That will also feature the contributors of the magazine, and that will also deal with the issues of